Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everyone. Before I start the class on the Buddha's teachings, I want to mention that today at 12 noon, we're going to have a special short service in order to generate merit to give support to the people of Burma, especially the monks and nuns who this past week have had to undergo a terrible ordeal. So if you are free, if you don't have to return home immediately, please stay until 12 noon and participate in this service. We will have just a short talk by myself, then chanting the Metta Sutta. I will chant in Pali and all of you will chant in English, and then the monks and nuns in Kuan Monastery will chant in Chinese. Then we'll do a short, maybe 10-minute meditation on loving kindness and compassion, and then following that to share the merits with the people of Burma. Okay, now we've come to our course. And in my first talk I mentioned that the course will be structured around this book in the Buddha's words, and I use as the primary way of organizing the teachings of the Buddha the distinction of the benefits which the Buddha's teachings lead at 3 levels. We call them the level of the benefit, the welfare and happiness right here in this present life. The second level is the benefits, the welfare and happiness to which the practice of the Buddha's teachings lead in future life. And then the third benefit is the ultimate benefit, which is the attainment of liberation in this very life. And then the teachings are divided, or we will discuss them as divided according to these 3 levels. But before we enter directly into that subject, I want to begin, as I begin in the first chapter of this book, by taking an overview of the problems that the Buddha's teaching is intended to solve, those problems of human existence which the Dhamma is designed to address. I would say that any great religion has a particular view of human existence. What are the essential problems of human existence? And then the religion and its teachings is intended to address those problems of human life from the particular angle in which it focuses upon the problematic nature of human existence. For example, Christianity, and by Christianity I'm not referring to the teachings of Jesus himself, but to the developed doctrines of Christianity, has its own way of focusing upon the essential problems of human existence. From the standpoint of Christianity, the essential problem of human existence is the alienation of humankind from God, the Creator. And this alienation comes because of the human tendency to sin, the sinfulness of human existence. And then the great problem is that human beings, by nature of their sinful by reason of their sinful nature, can never on their own reconcile themselves with God. This requires an intercessor, an intermediary. But since no human being can function as an intermediary, it has to be God himself who comes down in human form by having a human being with two natures, the divine nature and the human nature. That being, through his sacrificial death and resurrection, is able to bridge this alienation between man and God, and thereby create the possibility of reconciling the two, and to bring man or human beings back into divine favor. Okay, Buddhism has its own way of approaching or examining human existence. And the first chapter of this book, in the Selected Suttas, is intended to give a kind of overview of how Buddhism regards the problematic nature of human existence. I say that the problems that appear highlighted in this chapter might be seen as the way the future Buddha, the Bodhisattva, while still dwelling in the Tusita heaven, perceived human life before he made his descent and took birth into the human world as the being who is to become the Buddha. And if we look at these selections carefully, we could see how each selection in its own way is forming a link to the particular benefit at one of those three levels to which the Buddha's teaching is intended to lead. So let us start. We should all have copies of the book. We start with the first selection. Okay, in this selection, the king of the state of Kosala, whose name is Pasenadi, came to the Buddha and asked the question whether anyone who is born can be free from old age and death. And the Buddha replies to him, first with the general statement that no one who is born is free from aging and death. And then he goes on to elaborate and says, even those affluent Khatriyas, the Khatriyas in India at the Buddha's time, this was the administrative class. Those who held the positions of government, the leading warriors, the princes and kings. So even these affluent Khatriyas, who are rich with great wealth and property, with abundant gold and silver, simply because they have been born, are not free from aging and death. Then the Buddha continues that even the affluent Brahmins, affluent householders who are rich with abundant wealth and grain, simply because they have been born, are not free from aging and death. And then he says, even those monks who are arahants, who have destroyed all of the defilements and who have become completely liberated through final knowledge. Interestingly, he doesn't say that they undergo aging and death, but he says even for them, this body is subject to breaking up, subject to being laid down. Okay, so this passage highlights the first great problem that the Buddha's teaching is intended to deal with. This is the problem that all human beings, in fact all living beings, are subject to aging and death. And in the Anguttara Nikaya, one of the four collections of discourses, there's a very short statement of the Buddha, which comes in a rather long, complex sutta. But the sutta begins with the statement that if there were not three things in this world, there would be no arising of the fully enlightened Buddhas. What are these three things? Old age, illness, and death. But because there is in this world old age, illness, and death, therefore, the Buddha says, there is the arising of fully enlightened Buddhas. Now, probably most of you are familiar with sort of legendary story of the Buddha's life, that he had never before, while living in the palace for 20-something years, even knew of the existence of old age, illness, and death, till one day he went on a journey outside the palace, went on a journey into the town of Kapilavastu, and there for the first time he saw an old man, a sick man, and then a corpse being led in a funeral. Interestingly, we do not find in the Sutta Pitaka itself that story being related by the Buddha about himself. It does come in the canon in the Digha Nikaya, but in the sutta where the Buddha is speaking about an earlier Buddha named Vipassana. So it seems that in the earliest state of the Buddha's teaching, that particular story did not exist, but it was later developed, and then it found its way into the Digha Nikaya as a kind of legend which encapsulates a particular message, the message that old age, illness, and death are an inevitable part of human existence. Now, the way the future Buddha reacted to this discovery or reflection on old age, sickness, and death was to seek a path to liberation, a path to enlightenment and release from the cycle of birth and death. But, and this is an important point, when you look at the Buddha's discourses as a whole, one doesn't see that the Buddha actually begins by using the fact of old age and death as an immediate motivation to seek liberation, to seek nibbana, the ending of birth and death. Rather, at the lower level of the teaching, he uses this fact of old age, sickness, and death as a spur to us to transform our way of life from the self-centered, greed-based, deluded way of life to an ethical way of life, a way of life which is guided by moral principles and by a concern for the well-being and happiness of others. The Buddha conveys this point because within his teaching, this life is not the only life that we live, but each life is a link in a chain of existences. And what connects one form of life to the next form of life is our karma, our volitional action. The deeds that we perform in any given life, the good and bad deeds, the wholesome and unwholesome karma, this becomes the cause which generates our birth into the next existence. And so each of these lives that we pass through is connected in this chain of cause and effect. And the causal factor that determines the particular form of existence into which we are reborn, the particular conditions or circumstances of our life, is our karma, our volitional actions, the good and bad deeds that we do. So if one has a narrow and limited point of view, just concerned with one's well-being in this life, here, without thinking about future lives, one will not reflect on the consequences of one's actions. I should say that this is the way of thinking that was prevalent in India in the Buddha's time, that those who deny the existence of any life beyond death will act selfishly under the impulses of greed, anger, hatred, and ambition. I should say that in my own reflection in contemporary times, we find that there are many people who don't accept the idea of rebirth or any kind of future life, who do lead very highly moral lives based simply on their conviction and the need to be ethical in one's dealings with others. But in the Buddha's time, the common presupposition throughout the society was that our lives are connected together in a series of lives, birth after birth after birth. And those who rejected this conception of future existences and just focused on the present life would have the idea that there's no point in being moral and being ethical. But since this is the only life we live, we should try to get the maximum enjoyment out of it for ourselves. But the Buddha is presenting a different point of view. This is the point of view that when we see that our life here is part of a chain of existences continuing into the future, then we will recognize that our actions in this life will determine our migrations into future lives. And this will form an incentive for abandoning an unwholesome or immoral way of life and for developing a wholesome, ethical way of life. We see this point illustrated in the second sutta that we have in the book. Again, this is spoken in a discourse to King Pasenadi of Kosala. King Pasenadi of Kosala was a devout supporter of the Buddha and the Buddha Sangha. But he doesn't seem to have been a person whose wisdom was highly developed, since we don't see the Buddha teaching him any discourses on what we would call the higher Dhamma teachings. Nothing on the three characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and non-self. Nothing on dependent origination. No guidance in systematic meditation practice. But when the Buddha converses with King Pasenadi, he deals with him as a practical man of the world and gives him ethical guidance that will help him live his life so that he will have a happy future life. And so one day King Pasenadi comes to the Buddha in the middle of the day and asks him, why are you coming here in the middle of the day? The middle of the day was generally not the time for lay people to visit the monastery. And King Pasenadi says, just now I have been engaged in those affairs of kingship typical for kings who are intoxicated with the intoxication of sovereignty, obsessed by greed for sensual pleasures, who have attained stable control of their country, and who rule, having conquered a great sphere of territory on earth. I suspect that King Pasenadi actually said simply that he has been engaged in affairs of kingship. And the compilers of the canon wanted to elaborate on that by showing what the affairs of kingship entail. Okay, and now the Buddha must have known that when King Pasenadi undertakes his administrative responsibilities, he's sometimes motivated by this urge for greed, for expanding his possessions, for conquering other territories, for increasing the wealth of his own land. So now the Buddha is going to give him a teaching in a very practical way by using a simile. He says, suppose there was a man should come to you, coming from the east, and he says to you, Great King, I am coming from the east, and there I saw a great mountain, high as the clouds, coming this way, crushing all living beings. And then another man comes from the west, another from the north, another from the south, and they each report the same thing, that in the area where they're coming from, there's a great mountain which is rolling along, moving, and crushing all living beings along its way. And so the Buddha then asked him, in such a situation, such a terrible situation, what should be done? Here there are 4 mountains coming from each of the directions, closing in on the capital city, on Savatthi. So what should the king do? When you reflect on this, one knows that in such a situation, death is inevitable. We do not have much time to live. And so the king says, in such a great, terrible situation, and since the human state is so difficult to obtain, what else should be done but to live in accordance with the Dhamma, to live righteously, and to do wholesome and meritorious deeds? Notice the king is not saying that this is the time to meditate and achieve nirvana, but the king, as a practical man, recognizes the need to do wholesome deeds as a preparation for the future life. And so then the Buddha says to the king, I announce to you, I inform you, great king, I announce to you that aging and death are rolling in on you. And when aging and death are rolling in on you, what should be done? Then the king says, with aging and death rolling in on me, what else should be done but to live in accordance with the Dhamma, to live righteously, and to do wholesome and meritorious deeds? And then the king goes on to declare that when aging and death are coming, one can't use all of one's armed forces to fight against them. One can't use negotiations and say, please give me another 10, 20 years. I'll give you this in exchange for the 10 or 20 years, since aging and death won't listen. One can't use one's wealth to bribe them and say, give me another 10 or 20 years. I'll give you so much money. But when aging and death are rolling in, then we have to accept what's inevitable. And the consequence that the Buddha draws from this, or at least he gets King Pasenadi to bring this out, is to live by the Dhamma, to live righteously, and to do wholesome and meritorious deeds. Okay, the next sutta, sutta number 3, called the Divine Messages, brings out the same point in a somewhat different way. If you remember the story that I alluded to just before about how the future Buddha, when he was making the trip outside Kapilavastu, he saw the old man the sick man, and the corpse. Now in later Buddhist literature, these three sights that he saw are called the divine messengers. And even in some later works, the idea is brought in that old man, the sick man, and the corpse were not real human beings. But these were deities, devas, from one of the high heavenly worlds who had come down in this disguise, especially on this occasion, in order to give the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, a signal to waken him from his delusions and set him on the road to becoming a Buddha. And so a deity comes down and disguises or presents the appearance of an old man walking along on a stick. Another comes down and appears on a sick man vomiting and rolling in the ground. And another takes the form of a corpse being led in a funeral procession. Probably the funeral bearers were also devas or deities in disguise. Okay, we have this expression, the divine messengers, used in this sutta. This is probably the origin of that story. Here we have a case of some person of bad conduct who passes away, and because of his bad deeds, he is to be reborn in the lower world, in the hell realm. And before he's cast into hell, then he's given an opportunity to reflect on his previous life. And so the waters of hell grab him by both arms, and they take him before Yama. Yama is the Lord of the underworld. And now Yama addresses this man and lets him know why he's being punished by a rebirth in hell. So Yama says to him, or the waters of hell bring him to Yama and say to Yama that this man had no respect for father and mother, no respect for ascetics and Brahmins, and he did not honor the elders of the family. Now you can punish him as you wish. And then Yama, King Yama, the Lord of the underworld, questioned this man and asked him, didn't you ever see the first divine messenger appear among humankind? The man says, I did not see him. He doesn't even know who the first divine messenger is. Then Yama tells him, the first divine messenger would be an old man or an old woman, 80, 90, 100 years old, frail, walking with a walking stick, the youth all gone, the teeth are broken, the hair is gray or the head is bald, skin is wrinkled. Didn't you ever see a person like this? And then the man says, of course I've seen people like that. And then King Yama says to him, in such a case, didn't it ever occur to you, and this is the important line, I too am subject to old age and cannot escape it. Let me now do noble deeds, good deeds, by body, speech, and mind. Then this man says, I never thought in that way. I was being negligent or heedless. Okay, so the first divine messenger is old age. Then Yama asks him, didn't you ever see the second divine messenger appearing in the world of human beings? The man says, no, I did not see him. Then Yama says to him, didn't you ever see a woman or a man sick and in pain, lying in their own filth, sometimes having to be lifted up by others, other times being put to bed by others? And the man says, no, I never saw this. Or rather, the man says, the man says, I have seen this, but then Yama says, didn't it ever occur to you to reflect that I too am subject to illness and cannot escape it? So that is the second important reflection. And on that basis, one should think of doing good deeds by body, speech, and mind. Then Yama asks him whether he has ever seen the third divine messenger. So he thinks, divine messenger, what could that be? So he says, no, I've never seen him. Then Yama says, didn't you ever see a woman or a man lying dead, a corpse, for 1, 2, or 3 days? The corpse becomes swollen, discolored, and festering. Maybe in America this would be a rare sight. Even in our funeral parlors, they make the dead body look so beautiful, well preserved, as though it's still a living person. But in India, they didn't have any such techniques at that time. So when a person dies, they would bring it to the cremation ground, and sometimes the body might be kept there for days on end until it decays naturally. And so this man says, I have seen this. And then Yama brings out the important conclusion. Didn't it ever occur to you, an intelligent and mature person, that I too am subject to death and cannot escape it? Let me now do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind. Okay, so when we take this fact of a subjection to old age and especially to death, at the first level, we recognize the need, because we're going to move on in this cycle of rebirth, the need to transform our way of life if we are leading an unwholesome, selfish, greed-motivated way of life, or a violent and destructive way of life. We have to change over and begin by developing an ethical way of life, a life which involves care for others. This story mentions having respect and looking after one's mother, father, having respect for ascetics and Brahmins, that was typical in India, and honoring the elders of the family. And especially it mentions doing good or noble deeds by body, speech, and mind. Okay, so this I would call now the first problem of human existence on which the Buddha's teaching focuses, the problem of being subject to old age and death. And out of that, at the first level, it draws this conclusion, makes this inference that because of our old age, subjection to old age and death, we should turn our way of life around to a moral, ethical way of life. Okay, now we come to the second group of teachings. Here, I've used a heading for this group of teachings. I call it the tribulations of unreflective living. And this points to the need to change our way of thinking, our way of experiencing here and now in order to avoid the types of suffering that arise when we do not reflect carefully upon aspects of our present experience. And the first teaching under this heading is concerned with painful feeling. And again, the Buddha opens this teaching by using a very powerful simile. He first makes the statement that when the uninstructed worldling, this is the unreflective, ordinary person who doesn't examine his own life, when this person experiences a painful feeling, then he becomes miserable and upset. Sometimes he becomes so carried away that he starts crying and beating his breast and just loses his mental balance. So the Buddha says that this person experiences two feelings, the bodily feeling and the mental feeling. And then the Buddha illustrates this with that powerful simile. A man is hit by a dart or an arrow, and then immediately afterwards he's hit by a second arrow. And so this man is feeling two types of pain. The pain arisen from the first arrow and from the second arrow. That illustrates the way this unreflective, uninstructed, worldly person experiences pain. Then when that painful feeling arises, then he feels or experiences hatred towards that pain. He resists it, tries to fight against it. And this causes the inner turmoil to become even stronger and more obsessive. And then to escape from that painful feeling, the only escape he knows of is to indulge in sensual pleasures. And so in this way, the underlying tendency to aversion first becomes strengthened by the painful feeling, by indulging in sensual pleasures as a way of drowning out the painful feeling. Then he strengthens the underlying tendency to lust for sensual pleasure. And since he's living in a state in which he doesn't understand the nature of feelings, he still remains clouded or enveloped in the clouds of ignorance or delusion. The Buddha contrasts this with the way an instructed noble disciple, this is the disciple who has listened to the teaching and understands the teaching, the way this disciple will respond to painful feeling. When painful bodily feeling strikes such a disciple, he doesn't let himself become overwhelmed by misery, by grief, by self-pity. But instead, he keeps the experience of feeling simply at the level of painful feeling. Of course, this is very difficult to achieve, and so the Buddha here is speaking about a disciple who's very highly accomplished in the development of mind. So when this disciple experiences the painful bodily feeling, he uses his mindfulness, his clear comprehension to realize that now I'm experiencing painful feeling. You might reflect that this painful feeling arises because this is the nature of the body, to be exposed to contact. Through this contact, feeling arises. This feeling is conditioned. It's impermanent, not lasting. And so he'll just observe that painful feeling, the painful feeling of the body arising, passing away. He might apply to it the contemplation of non-self, thinking that this painful feeling is not really mine, not I, not myself. And in this way, he becomes detached from the painful feeling. The Buddha compares a disciple like this to somebody who is hit by a single arrow. That arrow is the bodily pain. As long as we have the body, painful feeling has to arise. But if one has the mind developed, then one doesn't let that painful feeling trigger off mental feelings, feelings of misery, self-pity, worry, anxiety. As an illustration of this, the famous story is told about from the Buddha's time. The Buddha had a cousin named Devadatta who was very ambitious and wanted to take control of the Sangha by killing the Buddha. And so one time when the Buddha was walking back and forth on a path, Devadatta was up on a hill behind a big boulder, and he pushed that boulder so that it went rolling down the hill, heading straight for the Buddha, as though to kill him. But before that boulder got to the Buddha, it hit against another rock and shattered. But one chip of that boulder flew off and hit the Buddha in the leg and wounded him, drawing his blood. And so this was extremely painful, but the Buddha, it says, just endured that pain. It says that the pain was so severe that it was crushing and excruciating and agonizing pain. But the Buddha just endured that pain, mindful, with clear comprehension. Okay, so when one develops the mind like this, then even though the painful feeling arises, one protects the mind from submitting to its decree, from falling into misery, grief, self-pity. And then in that case, one feels only the one feeling, like the man shot with a single arrow. And by doing this, one reduces the unwholesome tendencies to aversion towards the painful feeling. One doesn't have to escape from the painful feeling through sensual indulgence. And because one is understanding the nature of painful feeling, the nature of the body, then one is countering the tendency to ignorance and delusion by developing wisdom. Okay, the next teaching under the same heading deals with another cause of suffering in human life that arises through unreflective living. In our lives, we're constantly subject to what we might call the play of opposites. That is, our fortunes within this world oscillate between favorable results and unfavorable results. We call fortune, good fortune, and misfortune. And Buddhist tradition has compressed the different types of fluctuations to which we are subject in life into 4 pairs of opposites. These are called the Attaloka Dhamma, the 8 worldly phenomena. We can also call them the 8 winds of the world, because the wind blows in opposite directions. And so these 8 worldly opposites are gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, and pleasure and pain. I was reflecting last night whether these completely exhaust all the types of opposites to which we might be subject. And I realized that they don't. There are some others to which one might be subject. One could be high status and low status, power and powerlessness, respect from others and then scorn and abuse from others, or high position, low position. And so we shouldn't think that these 8 are exhaustive, but they're a quite comprehensive catalog of changes in worldly fortune. And so what happens to an unreflective person when meeting these changing opposites? When the unreflective person makes a gain, acquires wealth, gets some honor or title, then this person becomes puffed up with happiness and then clings to that good fortune. But then when that gain vanishes, or when the person fails to get what he wants, then there comes sorrow and misery. Again, self-pity. Alas, I did not get it. How I set my heart on it. And so this happens with gain and loss, also with fame and disrepute. Somebody becomes a rock star, movie star, they're very famous, sports star, very famous. But then they get older and all of the rock bands are now going for a new generation of singers. And now nobody remembers Paul McCartney, who's he? Mick Jagger, who is he? But I think they're still famous. But the fame starts fading out and nobody remembers them. Then when you get disrepute, a bad reputation, ill fame, then one becomes upset. Similar happens with praise and blame, pleasure and pain. So the unreflected person grasps and first pursues the good members of these pairs of opposites, seeking to acquire them. If he fails to get them, he becomes upset. If he gets them and they fade away, then again he becomes upset. But through wise reflection, what the Buddha calls the instructed noble disciple considers, it doesn't mean that this person completely avoids gain and loss, honor and dishonor and so on, but this person reflects that this gain that has come to me is impermanent. It's not lasting, not secure, but I can lose it. It's bound up with suffering. As if one clings to it, when one loses it, then one undergoes misery. And it's subject to change. It can just fade away and disappear. And so he reflects in this way when loss comes as well. And so the Buddha says, in this way he will not be elated or puffed up by gain and won't be dejected by loss. He won't be elated by fame and dejected by disrepute, elated by praise, dejected by blame, elated by pleasure, and dejected by pain. Okay, so that is a second teaching related to unreflective living. The third teaching comes under the heading anxiety due to change. And this teaching takes us to a very deep level where the Buddha explains how agitation or anxiety arises through clinging to these five aggregates. If you're familiar with the Buddha's teaching, you know that the Buddha analyzes, explains human person in terms of five constituents, the five aggregates of material form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. At this point, I don't want to go into a detailed explanation of the five aggregates. That will come later. But in this sutta, the Buddha is explaining how the uninstructed person, this is the unreflective, undisciplined person who's untrained in the Dhamma, regards these five aggregates as the self, or as something belonging to the self. And so when any of these five aggregates change, then his mind becomes preoccupied with that change in the five aggregates. When the body starts to get old, you look in the mirror and you start seeing gray hairs, skin gets wrinkled, maybe your actions are no longer as steady, as as sure as they were at a younger age, then you start to become worried and anxious. I'm getting old. The body is changing, moving towards death. When feelings change, feelings of pleasure change into pain. When perceptions of good things change into perceptions of bad things. Volitional formations, one's wills and intentions change against one's desire. Then the mind becomes preoccupied with this change. And then the Buddha says, agitation and a group of mental states born of preoccupation obsess the mind and remain there. And then with the mind obsessed, one becomes frightened, distressed, and anxious. And in this way, through clinging, one becomes agitated. But the reflective person, the one who has learned the Buddha's teaching and who is trained in the Buddha's teaching, when that person undergoes any changes in the five aggregates, they look upon that change without any kind of anxiety or mental preoccupation. That person will recognize that these five aggregates are not mine, not I, not myself, and it is simply their nature to change. And so the Buddha says, in such a person, there will be no agitation and other mental states arising because of the change in the five aggregates. His mind will not be obsessed, and thereby he will not be frightened, distressed, or anxious. And through non-clinging, that is, he doesn't cling to these things, which he recognizes as being not myself. Through not clinging, he becomes free from agitation. Maybe at this point I'll ask whether there are any questions on anything in these first sections.
In the sort of the spirit of come and see for yourself, the focus on the future lives and past lives is something that's more difficult and seems to be more something for me to take on faith at this point. Yet the fruits of following have also lead to fruits in this life that I guess you haven't spoken about, but it seems like there's a lot of focus on the old age and death as a trigger to think about the future lives. Yet even people who realize they get a diagnosis when they're ready to die in 6 months, suddenly they focus on actions in this life, even about their life. So how does that play in the Buddhism?
Well, first, I think that the benefit that I'm explaining in these sections on the contrast between unreflective and reflective living point to some benefits that are directly visible here and now, even quite apart from the question of future lives. As I said earlier, in the Buddha's time, the general assumption was that, or the belief to which most people subscribe, is that there are past and future lives. And this was taken to be closely tied up with the idea of commitment to a code of ethics. So in the Buddha's time, there were some teachers who proclaimed, these are radical teachers, that there is no future life, that a living being consists entirely of the material body. The mind is just an offshoot of the body. And so when the body dies, we completely perish and break up, nothing remains. And so the consequences that they would draw from this is that there's no point in making ethical distinctions of good and bad deeds. It's only a foolish person who observes restraint, who practices generosity, but one who seeks his happiness here and now should just follow his own desires and indulge them. That was the teaching of some of these radical teachers. As I said earlier, in my own view, looking at the contemporary period, it's possible to lead a highly ethical life by following, even without accepting the idea of any future life. And I think that just the firm commitment to ethical principles will bring its own reward here and now. And we'll come to the question whether the acceptance of future lives, the idea of karma and rebirth, is essential as an approach to the Buddha's teaching. I will come to that in a later class, which is dealing with the subject of approaching the Dharma. This is the class that is scheduled for October 6th, but probably will be moved to October 20th. Okay, there was some other questions. I saw hands on this. Oh. Okay.
When you speak of the wind, the changing forces that all human beings and becomes that all beings are subject to, it's very difficult in the world today not to see that some people are subject to a great deal of physical suffering, and others are much more fortunate. And I've heard the Dalai Lama say on occasion that he finds mental suffering that's been encountered in the United States greater than physical suffering. But so there's something kind of unpalatable about comparing starving people in Africa with very wealthy people who are suffering from boredom. Anyway, I wonder how what your the seeming inequity, rebirth that accounts for it, or do you have a broader?
This is very hard, a very difficult issue to deal with. Probably, if I were to use the Buddha's teachings as a template for understanding situations like that, it would be explained in terms of karma and rebirth. But I don't think in any way that understanding a situation like that in terms of karma and rebirth becomes then a kind of basis for inaction, or for feeling that people who receive such fate are receiving what they deserve and that therefore we have to neglect them. But I do agree that feelings of physical pain through hunger, through physical injury, can be much, much more severe than the feelings of mental pain. And there's a question coming from, maybe if you take the microphone, then it becomes easier for everybody to hear.
So what I understand about the Buddha teaching is that when one realizes that my life now on this level, the reflection comes as quite a delightful pleasure to grasp something. And I wonder if, as I do, I have the ability to grasp for a moment before I have to be that.
I'm not quite sure I understand. Do you have the freedom to make the choice between grasping and
as I do that, I become aware or conscious of a feeling, and I would like to know if it's appropriate for and certainly to acknowledge ownership of that feeling, be it pleasure or pain, and so that I can identify it again. Is that the question?
I think if I understand the question, one certainly will recognize the feelings that one experiences. But the point of what the Buddha is saying in this sutta is that it's when one grasps and then becomes attached to the pleasant feelings that one then makes oneself susceptible to, again, misery, dejection, when those pleasant feelings pass away. But one point that I think has to be emphasized is that the Buddha is not discouraging people from experiencing pleasant feelings. Because especially when the Buddha makes a distinction between two types of pleasant feelings. Pleasant feelings that arise from unwholesome activities and the pleasant feelings that arise from wholesome activities. And so what he says is that it's the pleasant feelings that arise from unwholesome activities that we should become detached from. And the pleasures that arise from wholesome activities, when they bring joy, delight to the mind, these types of pleasures we should pursue and even intensify them, but without clinging to them. Did I get the point of the question?
I have a question. I know the book that you wrote
Yeah.
And so when you come to the podcast, you also use different speaker from different guidelines.
Yeah.
So I just want to experience what time when were those 4 days in Gaya were less awakened? Okay. So let me know the rough time in which they were assembled.
Yeah, I think I did. I dealt with this the first class. Were you here on the first class? Were you here for the first class that I gave? Yeah, I dealt with that in the first class. Okay, but the teachings were compiled shortly after the passing away of the Buddha, a very early strata of discourses. Probably the Nikayas would have evolved over the next 100 years or so, up to the time of the Second Council. But they were always transmitted orally from teacher to disciples, till in the 1st century BC, in Sri Lanka, they were written down in the form of Nikayas. I also have some history about the Nikayas in the introduction, the general introduction to this book. So if you read the general introduction, then you'll find that information. Okay, then I will continue. Now I come to the third major heading for types of problems with which the Buddha's teaching is concerned. And here, and this heading, the general heading, is a world in turmoil. And the discourses under this heading deal with some of the broader types of suffering that afflict human beings, especially fighting, quarrels, and war. The first is a very short discourse spoken by one of the Buddha's disciples called Mahakaccayana. And a householder asked him, why is it that householders fight with householders? And then Mahakaccayana replies, it is because of attachment to sense pleasures, adherence to sense pleasures, obsession with sense pleasures, that Khatriyas, Brahmins, and householders fight with one another. Then the inquirer asks another question. Why is it that ascetics fight with ascetics? And Mahakaccayana replies, it is because of attachment to views, adherence to views, and obsession with views that ascetics fight with ascetics. I think this statement, this explanation would have to be drastically revised in the light of our historical experience over the last few centuries, since views also become a major basis for conflicts between people in the world. We've had conflicts between communism and capitalism, between free market economy and state-controlled economy. People hold different opinions, even in day-to-day life, on different issues, and then they fight over these issues. And so it seems that adherence to views, attachment to views, is a basis for conflicts at every level. Okay, in the second sutta, Sakka is, in the Buddhist cosmology, he's the ruler of the gods in one of the heavenly worlds. So Sakka becomes a disciple of the Buddha, and then he asks the Buddha, he says, beings, this could be understood as people, wish to live without hate, without harming one another, without hostility, without enmity. They wish to live in peace. So that is what beings want. But what is the reality? The reality is that they live in hatred. They harm one another, destroy one another, and they become enemies to one another. And so Sakka asked the Buddha why this happens. What is the root cause of this? Then the Buddha gives an explanation. He says it's because they are bound by the bonds of envy and niggardliness or miserliness that beings who wish to live in peace find themselves locked in violent confrontation, in hatred. Then Sakka continues to ask questions why beings are bound by envy and niggardliness, and the Buddha gives an explanation which traces a chain of causation down to the nature of human thinking. And this is quite a profound explanation. He says that this is thinking in terms of friends and enemies, good and bad, and so on, arises from elaborating perceptions and notions. So through these elaborated perceptions and notions, you could understand this to mean distorted ideas, distorted views and ideas in the human mind. Their thinking becomes twisted and screwed up through their distorted thinking. Then they become victims of their prejudices, their biases, and in this way they gradually give rise to envy and miserliness. And then through envy and miserliness, they become locked in violence. Okay, so this is one way of viewing this chain of causation that leads to violence and hatred. In selection number 3, the same issue is taken from a somewhat different angle. Here, the Buddha begins with craving which arises dependent upon feeling. Then he traces out of craving another series of conditions. This goes through pursuit to gain, to making decisions about what one likes and dislikes. These decisions are based on desire and lust. The desire and lust arise through attachment through possessiveness is based on niggardliness, and then in dependence upon niggardliness there is defensiveness. And because of defensiveness, various evil, unwholesome things originate. Speaking in terms of the weapons of his period, he says the taking up of clubs and weapons, conflicts, quarrels and disputes, insults, slander, and falsehood. Okay, a fourth sutta within this broad category, tracing the roots of violence and oppression, begins with the three unwholesome roots: greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's on account of greed, hatred, and delusion, when people are obsessed and controlled by them, that they inflict misery on others, killing, imprisonment, confiscation of property, false accusations or expulsions. And then he adds, this is prompted by the thought, I have power and I want power. Okay, what is common to all of these discourses, these teachings in section 3? So they each have their own particular way of looking at the problem, but they're all dealing with the problem of human conflict, of violence, unjust domination of others. And though they approach that problem from different angles, what they all share in common is that they trace the problem to distortions in the human mind. So we don't have here an explanation of conflict and violence purely in terms of economic conditions, nor in terms of any kind of simply political conflicts that can be settled through political negotiations, but rather the problems are always traced to the distortions in the human mind, in the most general way to human greed, hatred, and delusion. And so to radically transform, we call the social and economic conditions of human life, what is necessary at the most fundamental level is to change the attitudes, the perspectives of human beings. Purely making external changes, of course, this can help to alleviate some of the most drastic forms of misery and deprivation, but it will not lead to any kind of lasting and secure transformation without a change in the attitudes, the perspectives, the motivations of human beings. Okay, then we come to section 4 of this chapter. This is called Without Discoverable Beginning. And these suttas deal with what I would call the most fundamental problem with which the Buddha's teaching is concerned. This is from within its own framework, and this is the problem of our beginningless bondage to the round of rebirth, what is called samsara. So in one sutta, the Buddha, to illustrate how long this samsara, this round of rebirth, has been going on, he says that if you were to take all of the grass, sticks, branches, and foliage in India, Jambudvipa, collect them into a pile, and then put them down, breaking off one stick after another and putting it down, and say, this is my mother, this is my mother's mother, this is her mother, going back, mother before mother. The Buddha says one can use up that pile of all of the sticks in India, the sticks and grass, but one would not come to the end of the chain of one's mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. And why is that the case? Because this samsara, this round of rebirth, is without any discoverable beginning. No first point can be found. And then the Buddha draws the conclusion that since that it's through this long time that we have all experienced suffering, anguish, and disaster, and filled the cemeteries. And so this is the reason for striving to become liberated from this round of rebirth. Section 2 makes the same point, except now one is tracing one's line of fathers. Okay, the Buddha's teachings divide the lifespan of a world system. We might call this of a universe. They call the cycle of a universe an aeon, or in Pali, kalpa, Sanskrit kalpa. And so the kalpa, we could say, is the period from the Big Bang to the maximum point of expansion of the expanding universe, then the time when the universe begins to contract till the time that contraction is finished and it reaches the end of the contraction period. And so each universe goes through these phases of expansion, contraction, expansion, and contraction. And each cycle is called a kalpa, an aeon. And once a monk asked the Buddha, what is the length of an aeon? And the Buddha said that it's not easy to count it and say it's so many years or so many hundreds of years and so on. But the Buddha gave this monk a simile to illustrate the age of the kalpa. He said, suppose there was a great stone mountain, a yojana long. The yojana is about 7 miles. 7 miles long, 7 miles wide, 7 miles high, one solid mass of rock. And then every 100 years a man would pass by and stroke it with a piece of fine cloth. This stone mountain would be worn away more quickly before the aeon comes to an end. It will be worn away before the aeon comes to an end. And then the Buddha says that aeons of such length, we have wandered through so many aeons, so many hundreds of aeons, so many thousands of aeons, so many hundreds of thousands of aeons. Because the samsara is without beginning. But even though the Buddha couldn't give the number of years of an aeon, maybe I can do it. They say that our present universe is 15 to 17 billion years old from the time of the Big Bang to the present. Suppose we're at the halfway mark in the unfolding of this universe. So 15 to the time it reaches full expansion might be 30 billion years. Then I would suppose the contraction phase would be another 30 billion years. So it might be 60 billion years. Okay, in the next sutta, a Brahmin comes to the Buddha and asks how many aeons have gone by. He's not asking how long is an aeon, but how many aeons have passed, gone by and passed. Actually, since samsara is without beginning, the number of aeons would be uncountable, incalculable. But the Buddha, in order to give the Brahmin some idea of what the word incalculable means, it doesn't mean simply 1,000 or 100,000. But he says, imagine the grains of sand between the point where the river Ganges originates, someplace in the Himalaya mountains, and the point where it enters the great ocean. Now there wouldn't be any sand there since there's now the city of Calcutta is there. But in the Buddha's time, it must have still been open country. And so all of this would have been lined with sand. And how many grains of sand are there on both sides of the river Ganges? Can anybody count this number of grains of sand? We would say uncountable. But still that number of grains of sand would, in actuality, be finite, would be calculable. If you had enough patience and a long enough lifespan, you could sit and count each grain of sand, maybe using a magnifying glass for the small grains. It would be a fruitful use of your time. One could still, in theory, come to an end. But the number of aeons that have gone by through beginningless time has to be literally uncountable, incalculable. Because samsara is without discoverable beginning. Then in the next sutra, which comes passage number 5, the Buddha shows what is it that keeps us bound to this samsara. What is the root that keeps the cycle of existence turning? First he says that there comes a time when the great ocean dries up and evaporates and no longer exists. But still, I say there is no making an end of suffering for those beings roaming and wandering on, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. So those are the two fundamental causes for this process of migration through samsara, ignorance and craving. Then the Buddha illustrates this point with two other comparisons. Then he comes to a simile. A dog is tied up on a leash and bound to a strong post or pillar. And the dog wants to break away from the pillar and to go out and run and to play. So it runs away from the pillar. It gets maybe 3 yards the length of the leash that's tying it. Then it stops. And so it thinks, I can't run any further outward, so it starts running around to get free from the post or pillar. And it's not a very intelligent dog, so it doesn't recognize when it's come back to a starting point, but it just keeps on running around and around and around the pillar till the leash gets completely tied around the pillar. Then it thinks, I can't go any further in this way, I have to run in the opposite direction, and it starts running in the opposite direction. But it can never break away from that pillar. And so the Buddha says, here the uninstructed, unreflective worldling regards form, feeling, perception, the mental formations, and consciousness as the self. He thinks, I am this is mine, this is what I am. And so he keeps running and revolving around material form, around feeling, around perception, around volitional formations, around consciousness. And in this way he remains bound to birth, aging, and death, not free from suffering. And so this is the deepest problem that the Buddha's teaching is intended to address, the problem of our bondage to samsara. And it does this the way to showing us the way to cut off that leash that's tying us there, and the way to end ignorance and to end craving. Okay, now I'll ask whether there's any more questions.
How can we take that image of the dog, which gives compassion, especially to animals, and apply that to ourselves and to each other, that same vision of compassion of what we're doing to ourselves? How can we effectuate that? It's not easy. eventually that. How can we translate that compassion that we have for the animals stuff on the tether to ourselves?
Well, actually, we are the dog which is tethered to the post, yeah. So it's a matter of having compassion for ourselves, or at least concern for our own well-being. And so that means to end craving and ignorance. So the whole point of the Buddha's teaching at the highest level is to show the way to end craving and ignorance.
This may sound very universe true. Since we are all on the most of us are on this leash, so we are suffering.
Yeah.
Do you think that the flights to the land of Nirvana are going almost complete, and the rest of the routes are heavily booked?
And the rest of the
routes, the passage to the rest of the routes, especially the Haru, is heavily booked today?
I say that the planes going through the rest of the round, the rest of the destinations and around are pretty heavily booked. Sadly, I think those that are going through the lower world are very heavily booked by those who are inflicting a lot of violence and suffering on others. I wouldn't say that the planes going to Nirvana are empty. There are still those who are on those planes, and probably some who have landed.
I'm sure this is very interesting to think about. I'm wondering if you could give us some suggestions about translating something into daily practice.
I think if I were to do that now, it would sort of preempt the rest of the course, since we're going to be dealing with that as we move into the teachings on the benefits leading to the benefits visible here and now in this life, the benefits that preparing our way for future life, and then the ultimate benefit of liberation. That's the whole point of the course, is to bring that out. Any further questions? Okay, if there are no further questions, then we will end the class with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so I will share the merits by reciting some verses in Pali, by sharing the wholesome karma of listening, of speaking the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma. We share the merits with the Dhamma protecting deities, other powerful beings, and then with all beings who are afflicted with suffering, asking them to rejoice in these merits and be happy and well. Oh, you're handing out the text, then you can follow along with my recitation. Akasata cha bhumata devanaga mahidika Punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu sasanam Akasata cha bhumata Devanaga mahidika Punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu desanam Akasata cha bhumata Devanaga mahidika Punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu mantaram Ekavata cha amhehi Sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe deva anumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya Ekavata cha amhehi Sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe buddha anumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sata anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya Prabhupadaya Avici Hetato Etantare Satatai Prapana Rupya Rupicha Asanya Sannino Dukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Niputim. Okay, thank you all for your attention. And we have our next class on October 6th. That will be next week.